So it's winter, it's cold, it's kind of depressing, you know, I'm feeling down. So I decided that I would read No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. So this book, it was written in the 1940s and was published in 1948, like weeks after Osamu Dazai's suicide. He killed himself along with a woman. And this book's it's a very autobiographical account. I've read up a bit on the author, and a lot of what happens in this book is just straight up what happened to the author. It's very dark. Of course, it's very well written. It reminds me a lot of Crime and Punishment, not in the story so much as just the general feel of it. Sort of, I, for whatever reason, whenever I'm reading anything written pre-war or taking place pre-war, if to me it feels devoid of color. And that's what this one, much like Crime and Punishment, to me feels like. Just gray, bland, dark. Just, I mean, the book itself is very depressing. But it's also very honest and very, you can tell that the author is really speaking from their soul and just trying to express what either they're going through or have gone through this character, Yozo. So the format of this book, there's a prologue, 4 sections which are labeled as notebooks. The first notebook, the second notebook, third notebook, part 1, third notebook, part 2, and then an epilogue. And in the prologue, the character sort of introduces the notebooks and specifically talks about these 3 photographs he found of this that came with these notebooks that depicted this character, this Yozo, who had written these notebooks. And in the epilogue, we get sort of a wrap up explaining how whoever supposedly fictional person who published this book, how he came into possession of the notebooks. The notebooks themselves are written in the first person, past tense, by this character Yozo, and they detail his life from his childhood up until sort of this major event. Not major event, but there's a sort of an ending point. So spoilers now, I'm going to go through the whole thing. So it starts with Yozo's childhood. He was born to a really rich family, a really large family, the youngest son in northeastern Japan. His whole thing is that he doesn't understand people, and people terrify him. He can't see what's going on in their mind, and when he sees people get angry, he sort of, to him, that's the real person inside, and he wants to sort of mitigate that as much as possible. He's very much a people pleaser. He wants things to be predictable. He wants people to be predictable. So relationships are very important to him, but only in so that he sets the people around him at ease, so that they think that they understand him and are comfortable with him, and so he doesn't have to worry about them or what they think. He's very much, this book's all about alienation. Alienation from society, alienation from himself, alienation from just, it's all about just being separate and alone and a literal and alien around these human beings. This character Yozo, he just really does not get humanity, individuals and society as a whole. So as a child, he acts like a clown. He goofs around. He sort of makes a fool of himself so that others will laugh at him and sort of see him as beneath them and as sort of understandable and predictable. And so that way he gets through life, and he becomes really good at this deception of just joking around, and that's how he gets through most of his childhood. While he's a child, he describes, not in detail, but not even explicitly, but he implicitly, well, anyways, he says that he was abused by the people in his father's household, the servants, and he describes it as the most despicable act that you can do to a child. Yeah, so he was abused as a child, which that's just sort of one more tragic aspect to this incredibly tragic life. He describes one event where there's this boy who's not a very bright boy, but Yozo does something goofy in class. The boy comes up and says, "You did that on purpose." And that's like the most terrifying event for Yozo, that an outsider, this boy who's not even that clever, sort of sees through his illusion and understands that you're just putting on this act to sort of goof off. You're not you didn't actually mean to be this buffoon. And so that just terrifies him, that like, what if he tells everyone and then everyone realizes that I'm just a fraud, and they'll understand the real me, whatever that is. I don't even think Yozo knows what the real him is. There's a couple examples of this specifically. One of them was when he's a child, his father's asking all of his children, what would you like? Like, he's going off to Tokyo, he's gonna bring them home a gift. What would you like? And he asks them all, and then he asks Yozo, what do you want? What do you want me to bring home? And that sort of question, whenever Yozo's asked a question like that, he needs to answer in the way that the person asking the question expects him to. That's all he cares about, is how can I meet their expectations? How can I put them at ease? How can I tell them what they want to hear? And so asking a question that's requires some individuality and some sort of understanding of his own self and what he actually wants is just impossible for him. And so he sort of freezes up, and his father sort of like brushes him off and shuts the book and is like, well, fine, I guess you don't want anything, sort of thing. And that he's really upset, like, oh no, I've upset my father because I didn't answer the question the right way, but how am I supposed to know what I want? He later finds out, or overhears his father saying, he probably just wants one of those masks, like, or something that suggests that his father wished that he would have said that he had wanted a mask. And then he sneaks in to his father's notebook and writes in, I want a mask, so that his father later, when he's going to buy stuff, sees that it's written down, is like, oh, he wanted a mask all alone, he was just too shy to say it or whatever. And sort of all was well. This happens again later, which I'll talk about, when a character specifically asks him, what do you want, or where do you see yourself in the future, or what's your next step? And if the character would have just said, hey, your parents reached out to me, they have some money, they want you to get back to school, would that be okay? He would have been like, yes, totally, that's exactly what I want. But asking him, not explicitly stating that, but just sort of, this character is trying to be polite and not to be sort of gauche, and not to say, I have money for you to go back to school. This character said, what do you want, or how do you want your future to be? And that sort of general question that Yozo could not figure out, how do I answer that? What does this guy want me to say? What answer can I give him that will make him pleased? Just totally shuts him down. And that moment, which we'll get to later, is pivotal, and it just really throws his life off the rails, even more so than it had been. But anyway, so as a boy, he discovers painting, and he's really good at painting, and he really loves it. And it's sort of the only way he can find to truly express himself. But his father says, no, I want you to be a civil servant. You're not going to be a painter. So that sort of gets shut down. He's a very, very passive person. Whenever someone asks him to do something, he will say yes. He's a yes man. He's a people pleaser. He will bend over backwards to do anything, just because he does not understand humanity at all. He is so estranged from it. It's the most tragic thing about him, is that he just doesn't understand. So he like suffers from extreme social anxiety because of that. He, like, when he gets to university, he talks about how he can't go out on his own because he can't purchase things because he doesn't know how to do it. He fumbles with the money, and he ends up leaving without even taking the thing that he purchased, and he doesn't know how to sort of act the way people expect him to act. It's almost, reading it and the way I'm describing it, it feels like a type of autism, but I don't think it is that. I really don't think it is that. I think it's just this character is so separate from society that they just have no understanding of how human beings work. This character is so not human. The title itself, No Longer Human, is translated from the sort of actual title as something more like disqualified as a human, or someone that cannot be a human, or like a failure of a human being. And that's what the character very much embodies. So like I said, he graduates and goes off to university, where his father wants him to be a civil servant, but he still wants to do art. So he eventually sort of starts sneaking these art lessons and sort of skips his regular lessons. And then he meets this guy, Horiki. And Horiki sort of takes him under his wing, and he's a few years older than him, and sort of takes him out in the town, and he gets into drinking and going to see prostitutes all the time, and he very much develops this degenerate lifestyle where he quickly spends all his money, all his allowance, and he's on drinking especially, and starts down a very dark path. And this was what I felt was very reminiscent of Crime and Punishment, sort of the student, the broke student living in the city by themselves, succumbing to vices, which I don't think Raskolnikov was a huge alcoholic, but still, it really has that similar vibes to Crime and Punishment. So at one point, Horiki takes him to this sort of communist meetup. The communists are really suppressed at this time period, so it's sort of an underground movement. And because Yozo is such a people pleaser, he does not agree with the ideology. He sees them all as sort of infantile and it's kind of ridiculous, but whenever they ask him to do something, he does it. And so he sort of quickly rises through the ranks in this underground communist society, and he's running errands for them and liaising between different cells and doing all this stuff. And Horiki sort of leaves him to it and isn't really a part of the movement, but Yozo just can't say no and just wants everyone to be happy, so he goes along with that for quite some time. He gets tired of prostitutes, and he meets this woman who he also sees as someone who's very depressed. Turns out that she and her husband had moved to Tokyo, but times were tough, and they sort of were living in poverty, and the husband got caught trying to steal or something and ended up in prison. And she and Yozo hook up. She sort of talks about how she wants to end it all, and Yozo's like, sure, like same. So they try to commit suicide together. She dies, but he actually survives. And like I said, this is very autobiographical. That actually happened to Osamu Dazai. He literally tried to commit suicide with a woman, and she died, and he lived. But in the book, he gets sort of taken into custody as an accessory to a suicide, which is kind of weird that that's a crime, but I guess it makes sense that it is. But his family manages to smooth it over, and he has to drop out of school, and he ends up living in the attic of this friend of his father's, who's kind of like some sort of an attorney or of some sort. So he lives there, and he's not allowed to leave. He's not allowed to drink. He's very much cut off physically from society, even though through this whole book he's cut off from society in every other possible way. And that's when eventually the family says, like, hey, we'll pay for him to go back to school. So then this attorney guy says, like, so what do you want to do? Like, what's your plans for the future? And if he would have said, hey, your family wants you to go back to school. They're giving you money if you want to go back to school. If he would have explicitly stated that, then Yozo would have been like, yes, that's exactly what I want. I'll do it. Great. But because it was this sort of broad general statement that was meant to be a polite way of asking, Yozo was just thrown and he didn't know what to do. So Yozo flees, and he says, I'm going to see he wrote a note saying, I'm going to see my friend Horiki to sort of figure out my life. He goes to see Horiki, and Horiki's like, he's not his friend at all. Yozo doesn't have any friends throughout the whole book, but Horiki's like, Horiki treats him horribly, like almost like an animal, like he's not human. So he shows up at his house, and Horiki's like, what are you doing here? He gets a telegram that says that Yozo had run away, and he's like, you have to go back, like, I'm not dealing with you. But while this is going on, a woman shows up to collect a cartoon from Horiki. So Horiki's been writing cartoons for this paper that this woman's a publisher of, and she sees Yozo and decides to sort of, for whatever reason, take him in. She has a kid, but her husband has died a few years previously, so she takes him in as sort of her husband, and he becomes a kept man at that point. It's Japan's a very patriarchal society, and this is written in the 1940s, like set in the 1930s, but it is very much a very much sexist society, which you see throughout this book. This character has very sexist ideas, very strong opinions on women, which are certainly of the time, if that's any way to excuse them, or at least to understand them, not excuse them. So he's living with this woman. He starts creating cartoons for her, and he's actually making a living and doing quite well, but he quickly falls back into drinking. He maintains this relationship with Horiki, and they go drinking all the time. He spends all his money on drink. He ends up starting to sort of steal clothes from the woman he's living with, and pawning them off so that he can go drinking. And one time, after a sort of a 3-day bender, he starts to feel guilty enough that he heads back to the house, And when he's about to go inside, he sees the mother and the child sort of being very happy and having like a really nice relationship. And he realizes like, if I stay here, I'm going to destroy that. I don't want that. So he flees them. He ends up living with this tavern keeper woman, continuing his comics. He's sort of treated as a regular, and he's treated quite well by the people up the bar. But then he's still continuing to drink just tremendously. There's another instance where he meets this woman who's running, who works at a cafe, and he doesn't have any money, but he bums drinks off her. He ends up living with her for a bit, or sleeping with her, not living with her. He ends up sleeping with her for a bit. At one point, Horiki comes in and is going to like start kissing her, and he feels weird about it. Like, he's just using women left, right, and center. Anyway, so while he's at this tavern living with this woman, he meets this 17-year-old girl who's working in a shop across the way, and he describes her as a virgin in that she's so innocent and so sort of gullible and naive, very naive. And so he's really drunk, and she keeps telling him, you have to quit drinking, you have to quit drinking. So he finally says, I'm going to quit drinking, and if I can stay off the drink, I'll marry you. She's like, oh, that's great. But then the next day, and he like means it, but the next day, like by noon, he's drinking again. And so he gets super drunk, and that night he goes over to her and he's like, I couldn't do it. I got drunk. We can't get married. And she's like, oh, you're so funny. Like, you didn't break you promised me. Like, you didn't break a promise. He's like, no, I'm totally drunk. Like, look how red my face is. She's like, oh, that's just the sun shining off your face. You're so funny. She doesn't take him seriously because she's so naive. She believes he's just sort of joking and that he's still somehow sober. So they end up getting married. And like I said, he just keeps drinking. And during this time, he's still sometimes going and sleeping with the tavern keeper. He's still going and sleeping with this woman at the cafe. He goes back to the woman with her daughter that he had left, and he's sleeping with her. And he's just a horrible person. And one night, he's up with Horiki. They're drinking on the roof because, of course, they are. They sort of had this, not a fight, but he sort of sends Horiki away, and Horiki says something like, "I'm going to go sleep with your wife," or whatever. And as he's going down, Horiki sees Yoshiko, Yozo's wife, being sexually assaulted by this man, this other shopkeeper. And instead of like confronting them, sneaks back upstairs to get Yozo, and he's like, hey, come on, you got to see this. And like sort of rubs it in his face, like, look, your wife's being like raped right in front of you. And Yozo just sort of like, it really shatters him, and he sort of goes back up, and eventually his wife comes up and says like, he said he was just wanted to talk, and that he wasn't going to do anything. And he becomes really estranged from his wife at this point. He starts thinking like, okay, she was assaulted by this man. How many other men? Like, maybe she's been sleeping with Horiki. Like, he becomes very distant. Like, I mean, easy for him to say that he's been sleeping all over town. Speaking of which, because he's been such a drunk, he throws up one night into the snow, and there's lots of blood in it. So he gets really nervous, and he goes to this pharmacy, and the pharmacist there is, of course, a woman who says, like, you have to stop drinking. Just stop drinking. And he's like, I can't. Like, it's the one thing I can't. So she gives him a whole bunch of medications. She says, when it gets too much and you can't handle the need for drink anymore, take this. And she gives him morphine, of all things. So that begins his process of becoming a morphine addict. And, of course, it's great. He's got lots of energy. His cartoons are doing great. But he becomes very quickly addicted to it. He's not drinking anymore, but he's injecting himself with so much morphine. And just like the drink, he's out of money, but he's bumming it off this pharmacist, and then he's sleeping with her as well. And it gets to the point where he eventually, after he sort of caught his wife being assaulted, again, it's not her fault, by this man, because he's so depressed, he tries to commit suicide by taking a whole bunch of sleeping pills. He takes a whole bottle, and it knocks him out for like 3 days straight. But he eventually comes to and actually survives. And that's when his father's attorney and Horiki take him and decide that he has to go to a hospital. There's sort of an intervention, and they take him. They're like, we got to take you to the hospital. Like, so they take him to this hospital, and this is sort of the one sort of redeeming point in this whole dark book is his wife, who's so oblivious and naive, brings his medicine with them to the hospital, his morphine, and goes to give him the box of morphine, saying, oh, don't forget your medicine. And this is the first time in his life he actually says no to someone. And this is something that he actually really wants in so many different ways. I mean, it's his morphine he's addicted to. But it's at this point he can finally say no. And she's like, okay. So then they put him in this room and they shut the door and lock it. And he realizes he's no longer, it's not a hospital so much as a mental asylum or an insane asylum or whatever word they use for it. And so he's locked up there with no women. It's an all-male place with no drink, no drugs. And he's there for about a month, I think, or a couple months. And his eldest brother comes to him then and says, look, our father died a few weeks ago. With the money that he's left us, we're going to buy you a house way out in the countryside, and you're going to sort of live out the rest of your days there. So they put him in this country house, and they give him this old woman as a servant. He lives there. So he's living with this like 60-something-year-old woman who's his servant, and it describes that she sort of abuses him in some way. I'm not sure how or why. And like there's this one incident where he tells her to go buy him sleeping pills because he can't sleep. So she does, and he takes a bunch of them, but it turns out to be laxatives that she bought, presumably on purpose. And so he's, of course, really not able to sleep that night. It sort of ends that way. One of the final things that it says is that I was 27 or something. So all this tragedy and all this hurt and something, and he's only 27. And it feels like, and he says like he looks like he's 40. It's just because of the damage he's done to himself. But this character, this Yozo, he's so cut off from society. He does not understand humanity, but he does not understand himself. He sort of has no desire, other than his painting, which he never really gets to fully explore. That's the only thing that he can say that he likes. But because he wants to please everyone else and wants to sort of make everyone else comfortable and doesn't want to rock the boat, he never gets to sort of really understand himself and get to know himself. And so, yeah, it's just horribly tragic. And if that's not enough, the author, Osamu Dazai, he tried to commit suicide like 5 different times. Like I said, the one time with a woman that she did die, but he survived. And finally, so this book was published a couple weeks after his suicide, he finally did, the actual author in real life, he left his wife and 3 kids to go with this woman and had her as a lover, and then they both committed suicide together. So yeah, just a super tragic person. The book, the character, the author, all of it. It's just really, really dark and really depressing. But I think it's also important just to recognize that people do live like that. And there are people struggling like this, people to whom humanity seems like another species. So it's a really good book. But anyway, so that's No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai.